Some secrets refuse to stay buried, even when you dig the grave yourself. 6 days ago, Victoria Sterling stood beside a mahogany casket, watching as workers lowered her husband into the frozen ground. The funeral was perfect. The tears were convincing. The poison had worked exactly as planned. But what Victoria didn't know was that the man in that coffin wasn't her husband at all. And the real David Sterling was about to come home from a business trip that would turn her perfect murder into her worst nightmare. This isn't just another story about greed and betrayal. This is about the most carefully orchestrated murder you've ever heard, and the one detail the killer never thought she'd have to explain. Because sometimes the perfect crime becomes the perfect trap. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Deception. Victoria Sterling had perfected the art of being exactly what people expected her to be. At 32, she possessed striking beauty that made conversations pause and meetings run long. Her honey blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her designer clothes chosen with surgical precision, and her smile could convince anyone she was genuinely interested in whatever they said. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior lived a woman who viewed the world as a chessboard, and every relationship as a game she intended to win. She had married David Sterling 3 years earlier, not for love, but for the life he could provide. David was 41, successful beyond most people's dreams, and wealthy enough to make Victoria's childhood fantasies of financial security seem quaint. He owned luxury hotels across the southwestern United States, drove cars that cost more than houses, and wore watches that could fund small businesses. More importantly, he appreciated having a beautiful wife as an accessory to his success. Their marriage had been a transaction from the beginning, though neither had been crude enough to say so out loud. David wanted a woman who could charm his business associates and look stunning at charity galas. Victoria wanted access to a lifestyle that would erase every memory of growing up in a cramped apartment where her mother counted pennies. For the first 2 years, this arrangement satisfied both of them perfectly. David Sterling had built his empire through legitimate business acumen and carefully concealed illegal activities. The hotels were profitable and above board, but they also served as fronts for money laundering operations that funneled cash from criminal enterprises across state lines. Victoria discovered this gradually, finding encrypted phones, overhearing late-night conversations, and eventually piecing together that her husband was far more dangerous than he appeared. This discovery changed everything for Victoria. She realized David's wealth came with risks she had never considered. If his criminal activities were exposed, everything they had built together could disappear overnight. Worse, she could find herself implicated in crimes she knew nothing about, facing federal charges simply because she had been close enough to his operations to be considered complicit. The revelation that would ultimately seal David's fate came when Victoria discovered his identical twin brother, Daniel Sterling. David had mentioned having a brother on the West Coast, but he had always been vague about details. Victoria assumed this was typical of David's secretive nature about personal matters. She had no idea that Daniel was not just David's brother, but his identical twin, born 12 minutes apart and sharing DNA that made them virtually indistinguishable. Daniel Sterling had chosen a different path from his wealthy brother. He was a high school teacher in Oregon, divorced, living a quiet life that was the complete opposite of David's dangerous luxury. The brothers maintained a distant but affectionate relationship over the years, speaking regularly but rarely visiting. Daniel knew about David's questionable business dealings, but chose to maintain plausible deniability rather than ask uncomfortable questions. Victoria learned about Daniel's existence through a phone call she accidentally intercepted. David had been expecting an important business call and asked her to answer his phone while he showered. When she picked up, a voice that sounded exactly like David said hello. For a confusing moment, she thought David had somehow called from the bathroom, until the voice continued speaking about grades and parent-teacher conferences. The realization that David had an identical twin opened up possibilities in Victoria's mind that she had never considered before. If something happened to David, would anyone be able to tell the difference between him and Daniel? More importantly, Could Daniel's existence be used to solve the problem that was becoming increasingly urgent in Victoria's mind? Because Victoria had been planning to murder her husband for months. The idea started as a fantasy during particularly difficult periods in their marriage, when David's coldness and controlling behavior became unbearable. But as she learned more about his criminal activities and the legal risks they posed to her, the fantasy evolved into something much more concrete. Victoria Sterling was not the kind of woman who left anything to chance. If she was going to commit murder, it would be planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had gotten her everything else she wanted in life. And now, with the knowledge that David had an identical twin, she began to see possibilities for the perfect crime that went far beyond anything she had previously imagined. Chapter 2: The Web of Manipulation. Marcus Webb entered Victoria's life at precisely the moment when her marriage felt like a beautifully decorated prison. They met at an art gallery opening in downtown Phoenix, where Victoria was fulfilling her duties as David's wife by attending cultural events that enhanced his reputation. Marcus was 55 years old with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never met a problem he couldn't solve through charm alone. Marcus introduced himself as an investment consultant, which was technically true if you considered fraud a form of investment advice. He had spent 20 years perfecting various financial schemes, always staying one step ahead of investigators through careful planning and an uncanny ability to read people's weaknesses. When he looked at Victoria across that crowded gallery, he saw exactly what he had been searching for: a beautiful, intelligent woman trapped in a loveless marriage to a wealthy man. Their affair began slowly, built on late-night text messages and afternoon coffee meetings that Victoria told herself were innocent. Marcus was everything David wasn't: attentive, romantic, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. He made her feel like the most fascinating woman in the world instead of an attractive accessory to someone else's success. More importantly, he listened when she complained about her marriage, validating her frustrations and slowly planting seeds that would grow into something much darker. During one of their secret meetings at a hotel bar, Victoria mentioned David's life insurance policy almost casually. She had discovered it while looking through his files for tax documents, and the amount had surprised her: $2 million, with Victoria listed as the sole beneficiary. The policy included a double indemnity clause that would pay $4 million if David's death was ruled accidental. Marcus's interest sharpened immediately, though he was careful not to show it. He simply nodded and made sympathetic comments about how David probably saw the policy as just another business transaction. But privately, Marcus began calculating possibilities. $4 million was enough to fund a very comfortable retirement in a country without extradition treaties. The psychological manipulation that followed was masterful in its subtlety. Marcus never directly suggested that Victoria should murder her husband. Instead, he planted questions that made her reach her own conclusions. He wondered aloud what would happen if David's criminal activities caught up with him. He mentioned news stories about wives who had been prosecuted for their husbands' crimes. He expressed concern about Victoria's future security if David's empire collapsed. Victoria found herself researching poisons during her lonely evenings at home. She told herself she was just curious, just exploring hypothetical scenarios. But her internet searches became increasingly specific: substances that mimicked heart attacks, methods that left no trace in standard autopsies, timing that would ensure death occurred when she had a solid alibi. Marcus brought in corrupt contacts who could help execute their plan. Dr. Patricia Chun, a disgraced physician who could provide untraceable poisons. Robert Hayes, a financially desperate funeral director who could ensure a quick burial. Judge Martha Coleman, whose gambling addiction made her willing to expedite insurance payouts without thorough investigation. Victoria's plan crystallized around David's known preference for burial over cremation. He had mentioned this several times during their marriage, citing religious beliefs that Victoria suspected were more about tradition than actual faith. This preference would work perfectly for their purposes, as burial would make it much more difficult for authorities to discover evidence of poisoning after the fact. Marcus coached Victoria through every aspect of the performance she would need to give. How to appear shocked when David collapsed. What to say to paramedics to guide them toward a heart attack diagnosis. How to grieve convincingly while ensuring the body was buried as quickly as possible. The web of manipulation was complete, the players were in position, and Victoria Sterling was ready to commit the perfect murder. Chapter 3. The Perfect Storm. The opportunity Victoria had been waiting for arrived when David announced his urgent business trip to Seattle. A week-long absence was exactly what she and Marcus had planned for. It would provide the perfect window for David's murder while giving her an ironclad alibi. But what Victoria didn't know was that David had already suspected her. He had seen the late-night phone calls, caught hints of her affair, and sensed that her patience with him was wearing thin. Rather than confront her directly, David made a decision that would turn her scheme against her. Before leaving for his so-called business trip, David asked his identical twin brother, Daniel, to stay at the house and assume his identity. To Daniel, it sounded like another favor to help his brother keep up appearances while juggling business negotiations. But in reality, David wanted to see how far Victoria's loyalty, or her betrayal, would go. When Daniel arrived, Victoria felt the same double-take anyone would when faced with identical twins. He looked like David, carried himself with David's posture, and spoke with a cadence so close it was nearly indistinguishable. But there was something softer about him, something more approachable. Victoria chalked it up to her husband being in a good mood before his trip. Over the following days, Victoria found herself genuinely enjoying Daniel's company. He showed interest in her opinions, asked about her day, and seemed to actually listen to her answers. When they watched movies together, he didn't spend the entire time checking his phone. During dinners, he asked about her childhood and seemed fascinated by her stories about growing up in a working-class family. The poison Victoria had prepared sat in her jewelry box, carefully measured into doses that would build up in the victim's system over several days. She had planned to begin administering it immediately upon David's return, but with David in the house already, her plans simply accelerated. What she never realized was that she wasn't poisoning her husband at all, but the brother who had stepped in to play his role. Daniel attributed his mild fatigue and occasional nausea to stress about helping his brother and unfamiliarity with the rich food Victoria prepared. He had no reason to suspect that his brother's wife was slowly poisoning him under the guise of routine domesticity. Victoria became fascinated by the subtle differences between this David and the man she had married. He was everything she had wished David could be: attentive, kind, genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as an accessory. She wondered what her marriage might have been like if she had met this David earlier, not realizing she was falling into the very trap her real husband had laid for her. Neither Victoria nor Daniel realized that their time together was creating an emotional connection that would make the ultimate tragedy even more devastating. Chapter 4. Death and Deception. By the 6th day of Daniel's stay, Victoria had increased the poison dosage to lethal levels. She watched him struggle through breakfast, his face pale and drawn, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Daniel attributed his worsening symptoms to stress and exhaustion, never suspecting that his brother's wife was systematically killing him. The final dose came with dinner. Victoria had prepared Daniel's favorite meal from their week together, adding the concentrated poison to his wine with steady hands. She sat across from him, making casual conversation while monitoring his condition. Within an hour, Daniel was doubled over in pain, clutching his chest as his heart began to fail. Victoria called emergency services with perfect timing, her voice breaking as she reported her husband's collapse. The paramedics arrived to find her cradling Daniel's lifeless body, tears streaming down her face as she begged them to save him. Her performance was flawless, every gesture calculated to deflect suspicion. Dr. Chin's falsified medical records painted a picture of a man with an undiagnosed heart condition. The corrupt coroner, Robert Hayes, examined the body and found exactly what the paperwork suggested he should find. Hayes signed the death certificate without ordering an autopsy, marking the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest due to underlying coronary disease. Victoria insisted on immediate burial, claiming David had strong religious beliefs about quick interment. Hayes expedited the process, and within 48 hours, Daniel's body was lowered into the ground at Riverside Cemetery. Any evidence of the poison that had killed him was now safely buried 6 feet underground. The insurance investigation proceeded smoothly. Judge Coleman expedited the payout, and $4 million appeared in Victoria's account within a week. Victoria played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences with appropriate grace while internally celebrating her success. Marcus visited her the night after the burial, and they toasted their perfect crime with champagne. Victoria felt intoxicated by her success, convinced she had outsmarted everyone. The money was in her account, the body was buried, and no one suspected anything beyond a tragic case of sudden death in a young man with hidden health problems. For 6 days, Victoria lived in the euphoria of believing she had committed the perfect murder. She began making plans for her new life with Marcus, researching exotic locations where they could disappear with their newfound wealth. She felt clever, powerful, and completely untouchable. The knock on her door came at exactly 8:37 on the 6th evening after the burial. Victoria answered without checking the peephole, expecting another neighbor bringing sympathy casseroles. Instead, she found herself staring into the face of the man she thought she had murdered and buried. David Sterling stood on her doorstep, very much alive, carrying a suitcase and wearing an expression of cold fury that made her blood freeze. Behind him, she could see unmarked cars and federal agents positioning themselves around the property. Victoria's wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor as red liquid splashed like spilled blood. In that moment, she realized her perfect crime had become her perfect nightmare. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. Victoria stared at David in complete shock, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The man she had watched die, whose body she had seen lowered into the ground just 6 days earlier, stood before her very much alive. Her legs felt weak as the implications crashed over her in devastating waves. David stepped across the threshold without invitation, his eyes cold and calculating. Behind him, federal agents emerged from unmarked vehicles, surrounding the property with military precision. Victoria realized with growing horror that this was not a coincidence or mistaken identity. This was a carefully orchestrated trap, and she had walked directly into it. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind Victoria, his face pale as he recognized the catastrophic scope of their mistake. The man they had killed was not David Sterling at all, but someone else entirely. Someone whose death would expose their carefully planned murder instead of concealing it. David reached into his jacket and withdrew a small recording device, pressing play without ceremony. Victoria's own voice filled the room, discussing poison dosages and burial timelines with Marcus. Her stomach dropped as she realized David had been recording their conversations, gathering evidence of their conspiracy while they believed themselves safe. The federal agents moved efficiently through the house, securing evidence while David explained the truth that destroyed everything Victoria thought she knew. His brother Daniel had been staying at the house while David conducted business elsewhere. Daniel had been helping maintain David's presence in the city while federal investigators closed in on his money laundering operations. Victoria learned that David had been cooperating with federal authorities for months, providing information about his criminal associates in exchange for immunity. The business trip to Seattle had been a cover story while he worked with investigators to build cases against other criminals in his network. Daniel had volunteered to help his brother by staying at the house and being seen around town, creating the appearance that David was maintaining his normal routine. What Daniel hadn't known was that his brother's wife was planning murder, and that his resemblance to David would make him the perfect victim for a case of mistaken identity. David revealed that he had discovered Victoria's affair with Marcus months earlier. Rather than confronting them directly, he had decided to gather evidence of their criminal conspiracy. Hidden cameras and recording devices throughout the house had captured every detail of their murder plot. The poison Victoria had administered to Daniel, believing him to be David, had killed an innocent man who had been trying to help his brother stay ahead of federal investigators. Daniel had died confused and in pain, never understanding why his sister-in-law was slowly killing him. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Victoria realized the perfect irony of her situation. She had planned the perfect murder, executed it flawlessly, and succeeded in killing someone completely. But her victim had been the wrong person entirely, and her crime had been recorded from beginning to end by the very man she had intended to kill. The woman who had prided herself on being smarter than everyone around her had been outmaneuvered by her own husband. Her perfect crime had become the perfect evidence of her guilt. Chapter 6: Justice and Consequences. The exhumation of Daniel Sterling's body took place under heavy police guard 3 days after Victoria's arrest. The coffin was raised from the frozen ground at Riverside Cemetery, while forensic experts prepared to examine the evidence that would seal Victoria's fate forever. The autopsy revealed everything the prosecution needed to build an airtight murder case. Daniel's tissues contained concentrated levels of the rare plant toxin that Dr. Chun had provided. The poison had accumulated in his organs exactly as planned, causing the cardiac arrest that Victoria had mistaken for a successful murder of her husband. Victoria's defense attorney attempted every possible strategy to reduce her charges. They argued mistaken identity, claiming she had intended to kill David rather than Daniel. They suggested temporary insanity brought on by an abusive marriage. They even proposed that Marcus had manipulated her into murdering against her better judgment. Nothing worked against the overwhelming evidence the prosecution presented. The recordings captured Victoria's voice discussing dosages, timelines, and burial preferences in chilling detail. The financial records showed payments to corrupt officials who had helped cover up the crime. The forensic evidence proved beyond doubt that Daniel had been systematically poisoned over several days. Marcus Webb received a plea bargain in exchange for testifying against Victoria. He provided detailed testimony about their planning process, the corrupt network they had assembled, and Victoria's enthusiastic participation in every aspect of the murder conspiracy. His cooperation reduced his sentence to 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Patricia Chun, Robert Hayes, and Judge Martha Coleman all faced federal charges for their roles in the conspiracy. Chun lost her remaining medical credentials and received 15 years for providing illegal substances and falsifying medical records. Hayes was sentenced to 10 years for falsifying death certificates and expediting fraudulent burials. Coleman was removed from the bench and sentenced to 12 years for judicial corruption. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated local headlines. Victoria's transformation from grieving widow to calculating murderer shocked the community that had sympathized with her loss. The revelation that she had killed the wrong person added a tragic irony that made the case even more compelling to media outlets. Victoria showed no emotion when the jury returned their verdict after only 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of insurance fraud. Guilty on all counts that would keep her in prison for the rest of her natural life. The judge sentenced Victoria Sterling to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the remainder of her days in a federal facility, her beauty fading behind bars while she contemplated the perfect crime that had gone perfectly wrong. David Sterling disappeared into the Federal Witness Protection Program immediately after the trial concluded. His cooperation with authorities had dismantled several criminal organizations, making him too valuable and too vulnerable to remain in his old life. The man who had built an empire on illegal activities vanished completely, leaving behind only the memory of a brother who had died trying to help him. Daniel Sterling was buried again, this time with the dignity and respect he deserved. David attended the second funeral under heavy federal protection, mourning the brother whose life had been stolen by a woman's greed and a case of fatal mistaken identity. Victoria had planned the perfect murder and executed it flawlessly. But perfection meant nothing when she had killed the wrong person entirely. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trust completely. If this story of mistaken identity and deadly consequences kept you on the edge of your seat, Hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories that prove reality is stranger than fiction. Because you never know when a perfect plan becomes the perfect trap.